just some background on myself. I got into solar in 2008 in residential contracting. And it was a market in Austin, Texas that was kind of gangbusters. This was in the era of what I think is probably excessive solar subsidization. Just as a case in point, one of our customers, this is a residential project in Austin. One of our customers did a system that was about 4 times as big as the solar array you see pictured, like a 11 or 12 kilowatt array back in the heyday of solar subsidization. And we sold the array for about $75,000. The city of Austin cut a check to the homeowner for $48,000, and the array with a 30% tax credit came with a $22,500 tax credit. So out of this $75,000 project, the customer really only paid about $5,000. I mean, when you look at the asset value alone of the array, that customer received a return on his investment before the solar array generated a dime of electricity. Now, in the solar industry, we would call that an easy sell, but it's also too much of a good thing. What happened in the city of Austin back in that era is they would open up their rebate program for one day only, and it would be a mad rush to go and get in all of, an entire year, maybe year and a half's work of projects. You'd have to have all wound up on January 1st. And if you didn't shove the application under the door at the right way when the clock struck 8 a.m., you might lose out on a year and a half worth of business. At the same time, the customers are pretty happy because those that do get approved really aren't paying for their solar arrays. And then what happens is the program runs out of funds, they cancel it and call it a victim of its own success. Now, I don't think solar incentives are being so mismanaged today, but it is a recurring theme of solar where it has heavy subsidies that drive projects to market, and then the subsidies get scaled back. And it kind of leaves designers and installers and potential customers with this feeling of, well, what do we do now to make solar more cost effective? Obviously, we can't, rely on these subsidies. And there's a danger in solar where you have someone like me who, knows solar like the back of their hands. In years past, I've been more of a subsidy program expert on how to milk these programs for all their worth. So as soon as, the subsidies pop in Austin, Texas, I go on the road and teach, and that brings me out to Mississippi where the subsidies are just getting off the ground. And so for the past few years in Mississippi, back in 2010, 2011, 2012, the Tennessee Valley Authority was buying solar electricity at well above the retail price of electricity. And that led to some large scale project development. One particular client owned their own electrical contractor installation company. And together we built a 1 megawatt array and a 560 kilowatt roof mount array. And they were very profitable projects too. But now in the Tennessee Valley Authority region, that buyback program has basically, instead of buying the electricity for 2 times the retail price, nowadays they buy the electricity for about 1/3 of retail price. So it's like, the solar industry, it's like pushing the pedal all the way down on the car and then slamming the brakes. Why can't we do something a little bit more even-headed and rolled out? Well, that's what the industry is beginning to look like now that costs have come down and these subsidy programs are going away. Although there is a danger that when subsidy programs drop, the red tape remains behind. Now, just in my own area, in the Tennessee Valley Authority region, which expands beyond Tennessee into North Mississippi and Kentucky and Alabama, there are only 35 residential solar arrays to date. And these are power companies that have received rewards and accolades for solar leadership in the entire area of greater Tennessee. There are 35 residential load side solar arrays. And it's because they've had this incentive program that has changed the market away from, connecting solar to your service panel and having it roll back your electric bill into these utility scale power purchasing agreements, which they also apply to the residential level. And so in years past, the solar market has been very volatile. I mean, this one commercial rooftop project, this is the largest rooftop commercial solar array in Mississippi. It's 560 kilowatts. That one project was twice as large as my previous 3 years in the residential solar sector. So even though projects might be fewer and further between, they get larger and larger. We went from this 560 kilowatt array immediately into a project that was twice as large as the 560 kilowatt. And so, there is potential for economies of scale and growth. But, what you see in the market is, this one commercial array, effectively tripled the amount of solar power in Mississippi. But at the same time, it was at the tail end of the subsidization in Tennessee. And so you see a huge boom in solar, and the subsidy programs crash in the market. It may not even grow. It may stagnate and just wait for the markets to kind of relax. And then, what's been happening since 2014 onward is that, the federal tax credit for solar was extended. It was supposed to expire, but it was extended. Well, on the other hand, in the news lately, we hear about import tariffs. Well, solar import tariffs have been going on since, around 2012, coming to market about in 2014. So while there are new tariffs that are further holding back the market, it's not a new issue. Costs keep coming down. So where does this place the designer in this volatility? Well, perhaps we need to go back to basics, understand how to integrate solar into just mainstream construction scope, and maybe install it, not so much like a specialty scope, but just get your general craft. If your electricians are already on site doing electrical work on the building, having the structural engineer design the array layout, and then the electricians come in and install it. Making solar more mainstream is a good way to get out of this kind of solar specialist market, and getting out of a specialty contractor market, going into a mainstream labor rate can often improve the build quality of the array while reducing project costs. So all this stuff is what we're going to discuss today in class. This is a live program, so if you have questions, I want you to interact. I want you to ask questions. We have time and program for that. I'm going to go ahead and put in an invite link to my Slack community. Slack is a email, messaging, chat, tech support community that doesn't clog up your existing email or messaging systems. It's its own app. It's actually kind of fun if you want to learn about kind of more recent trends in data management. So I have a little bit of experience on larger scale projects, a lot of experience on residential and commercial projects in terms of modeling the projects, designing the projects, and then chasing the projects into the field and supervising the installation. Back in 2008, when I got into the market, the state the utility and then the federal government was covering the vast majority of project costs. The system owner would, especially if the contractor was floating the rebate check on behalf of the customer, the system owner might have only paid a small amount into what was an expensive project. And we do have to keep in mind that if I'm selling a $75,000 project, but the customer is only paying $5,000 of that, I don't really have much motivation to come down in cost. In other words, the subsidies can have an impact of maybe reducing the cost to the customer, but increasing the total project cost. What's happening in today's market is that we still have that federal tax credit, but the system owner is covering the vast majority of the project cost. On the other hand, the budgets are smaller. When I got into the industry in 2008, the cost, the hard, direct from the factory gate pricing of a solar module was around $3 per watt. Nowadays, if I go to Mexico and I buy a solar panel in Mexico, the same solar panel that you get in the United States, if I go to Mexico and buy a solar panel, it's going to cost me about 40 cents per watt instead of $3 a watt. So we've almost seen a 90% come down in the hard cost of the solar panel. In the United States, the panels are subject to import taxes. It takes that 40-cent a watt panel and brings the price up to about maybe 60 cents a watt to the distributor, and then maybe 70 cents a watt to the customer. So we have policies that are probably out of the control of you and I in the audience today that we just have to deal with and work around and just kind of follow how they impact the business model. We also have to be aware about how the subsidies have kind of monkeyed around what should be mainstream solar project development, because maybe the business models that are in the industry today that are subsidy driven aren't necessarily the business models that will stand the test of time as solar projects come to market absent subsidies. One thing that I think is very important to understand is that when you do a residential solar project, the majority of your project cost is not in material, and it's really not in the direct labor that goes to the people installing the array on the roof, your workers, your electricians. To an electrician, they might be getting paid market rate. They might be happy to have something new to do and just work as business as usual. But things like your direct labor cost is only a tiny portion of your total project costs at the residential level. And look, the cost of a solar module, so the actual hard cost of the solar module to a residential project, there is not substantial price difference between that cost to a residential project and that cost to a utility scale project. You might say, okay, well, you get purchasing discounts, and that might drive that 60 cent to the distributor model, to the distributor. You might be able to go and do a 100 megawatt solar farm, but it might only drive the price of that module down to 40 cents from 50 cents. There's not substantial economies of scale discounting in the modules. And and racking, for that matter, I guess what they're going to put is in structural BOS. That's in this lighter shade of green here. Your racking costs can actually go up at the utility scale level. Generally, they're going to be using tracking, but you can see for a fixed array versus the racking cost for residential, racking at the ground mount level, there's more metal involved. You're not just putting the truss that goes underneath the modules to support them, but you're building the foundation that the trust goes on top of at the utility scale level. So they do get economies of scale, volume discount purchasing, but they're also buying a little bit more foundation work. The inverter cost. The inverter is the brains of the system. It's not only the brains, it's the heart, it's the number one most likely component to suffer a manufacturer driven failure. So not a field install error, and we're going to talk about those. But out of your modules, your racking, and your inverter, the inverter is more often the component that you're servicing. And so utility scale inverters do cost about half the price as residential inverters. And a lot of that is due to economies of scale, but also sometimes the residential inverters have more functionality built into them and more parts. But we can see as a percentage of total project cost, even the difference between utility scale inverters and residential inverters, that might be the biggest swing in material cost between a utility scale and residential project. But even that inverter budget is a small portion of that bid you get from a residential contractor. And so what is the big difference? Well, the big difference is this what construction experts would call soft costs. So soft costs, sometimes the design and the engineering and the permitting is put into soft costs, kind of overhead costs that are not directly related to the field. Sometimes they are put in excluded from the soft costs because they can be directly ascribed to the project. When we talk about soft costs, we're talking about administrative costs, material markup, the profit margin that the contractor is gonna show up on their balance sheet. And so, one big difference between utility scale and residential projects is, the project developer for utility scale, their margins are their profit margin is substantially smaller than what you'd see at the residential level. But perhaps from a specialty labor versus mainstream labor perspective, the soft cost in the solar industry is high compared to mainstream construction. Usually this soft cost, so your supply chain, your overhead, and your margin is typically around 30% for, say, residential electric work. And in the solar industry, it's closer to 50%, which basically denotes that solar installer is not necessarily doing jobs every single day of the week. I have a site evaluation on Friday, and then the material will show up the Friday after, and then I have a job, and maybe I'll be scheduling some site evaluations in between that, but I'm not out in the field like an electrician is every single day doing a project. That forces me to charge more, because if I'm not charging for my downtime, then I'm going to go out of business. And that's, in some sense, you could be paying a solar installer a lot more money than a regular electrical contractor would charge to do the same work. And the solar installer is keeping that money, but they might be more likely to go out of business than that electrician who's been in your market for 10 plus years and has other stuff to do on site besides solar. So I strongly believe that the number one way to reduce cost in the solar industry is to simply stop using solar companies to install solar, and instead take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, when we do a project, a residential home construction, we design the home, we spec out the scope, we hand it off to a mainstream electrical contractor, and they might install, electrical components they've never installed before, but they have direction, and then they rely on their field experience to, kind of fill in the gaps where the scope is incomplete. The problem with solar is your building designers, because of those subsidies, have really been cut out of the process. When you have to shove the rebate program application under the door at the stroke of midnight so that the owner gets a free solar array, that requires a specialist who knows exactly what to do to qualify the project for the subsidy. That's not really the same thing as a mainstream just pull an electrical permit, install the electrical device. But what if solar could be that way? Before I got into the solar industry, I was in the oil and gas industry. I worked for a company called Fluor Corporation. It was actually very interesting, and I started working for them in 2006. And between 2006 and 2008, I was working in their oil and gas sector, but Fluor they build power plants, and they were also building silicon refineries. And what was interesting about their marketing reports on silicon refineries is one comment that struck out of me came from one of their 2005 marketing reports when they were first scaling up these silicon refineries for solar power. One of the guys in marketing said, "We actually don't know if this is a good idea or not because there is so few design and labor hours in designing and installing a solar array compared to a traditional power plant." Traditional power plant, you have all sorts of process equipment that has to be interconnected, and 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 not just interconnected, but it has to avoid each other physically in the process. So you have a big design and labor scope. Solar is very simple comparatively. It's either a bunch of modules on a roof with some wires coming down, but even at the utility scale level, it's a bunch of modules in the field with some wires going back to the point of interconnection, compared to other kinds of electrical design scope. Making how many rectangles can you fit into this larger polygon. That's something that is well within the skill of a mechanical engineer to figure out. And then when we understand the circuitry, we'll realize that most mainstream electricians are already familiar with the hand skills and circuitry involved. And so it's really the design phase of solar has been kind of poorly neglected from this subsidy process. And in order to transition the solar industry from kind of a specialty, turnkey, high margin scope into something that is more just installed on all homes to recoup your electricity use over a long period of time, wrapped up into your project financing so that it's cost effective. To do all that, especially with these rising import tariffs, we have to make solar cheaper. We have to work harder. And so to do that, we have to take a dedicated look at solar design. Okay, so the solar industry is projected for long-term growth. Now, what we see in this market in light blue is the utility scale segment. In middle blue, we're in the commercial segment, so like your Walmarts and IKEAs and whatnot. And then we have the residential segment. Now, I think this graph shows a few things that are interesting. The first is the impact of the tax credit. So the tax credit was originally supposed to expire at the end of 2016. And so what was thought was that developers would take projects out of 2017 and 18 and 19 and maybe even delay some projects in the years leading up to it and all install everything in 2016 to get that tax credit and take advantage of declining material costs as well. And so the tax credit for 2016 got extended at the end of 2015, and this little bubble happened anyway, because that's, by the time you get to the end of 2015, all your projects are planned to come out of the ground in 2016. And so even though the long-term growth trend for solar is positive, right now in 2017 and 2018, the solar market is actually in a state of decline, but it's kind of limited in effect. So, the solar market in the U.S. is contracting, but it really doesn't have to do with what's going on today in the industry. That's still, despite these cost increases, going towards long-term positive growth. But we can see how, subsidies do play a big impact in the business model. The tax credit for solar did not come to market until the tail end of 2009. So let's look at our market in 2010. I can't zoom in on this, but what we see is that actually the commercial market is the largest market segment. It's larger than utility scale. It's larger than residential. Way back now, I guess 2006 is now way back, but way back in 2006, the utility scale market was only 10% of the market. Nowadays it's more like 60%. It's the largest market segment, maybe even more than 60%, especially sometimes. But way back in before this chart, the utility scale market, back before the tax credit, back before subsidies, the utility scale market was less than 10% of the market. And primarily back before solar subsidies, the market was residential. And you either were residential off-grid, living in the woods where your home is so far away from the electric grid that solar power is your only good option. And there were some commercial applications of that same environment for smaller solar applications. But it was the commercial market segment that was the largest. In fact, in 2006, it was the first year that the commercial market was larger than the residential market. And so before the era of heavy federal solar subsidies, rooftop solar was where the market was. Point of use solar was where the market was. But when the tax credit got created, what happened was the utility scale segment in particular saw the most amount of growth. In some extent, the policies for utility scale solar are easier than the policies for consumer owned solar. And that's because, our electric policies are set by public utility commissions, but, unless you work in the power industry, you have very little reason to be involved in that process. And what's happened in the era of subsidies is we've taken our focus off what is fair policy for the consumer, and instead we're just focused on driving as much solar into, out of the ground as possible. And so the tax credit gets created, and there are some nowadays, there's plenty of below retail pricing solar opportunities for utility scale development, but there's still many pockets of the US where the policy for not solar, but just regular electricity, and if you generate electricity on site, what are you compensated for that? There's policies that are in the news about homeowners receiving retail price for their outflow, and that maybe that drives up the price of electricity for non-participants. And usually those reports come down on, what side of the fence you're on. The solar industry says, well, if we're increasing supply and we're not increasing demand, fundamentally solar is capping electricity prices and keeping them low, not increasing them. And the utility guys say, well, yeah, but you're declining our profit, and that means we have to charge more money. So, that's the other side of the equation too. And when so much money is being given away through subsidies, maybe the compensation of the actual electricity itself is less important. If I'm buying a $75,000 solar array and I'm getting $70,000 back through rebate checks and tax credits, I could sell the electricity for 20% of its value and still get a return on investment. So we're using kind of upfront incentives, and that does impact the market. And I do think there is a solar bubble in utility scale. Things like import tariffs do impact the utility scale segment more, and especially with the tax, if the tax credit sunsets and the import tariffs remain, we might see the market kind of shift back towards rooftop solar. Now, another interesting thing about this graph is, well, if rooftop solar before subsidies was the largest market and commercial solar had just become the largest market segment, well, what's happened to that commercial solar market? Because commercial rooftop solar is now the smallest market segment. When you go to the airport and you take off in an airplane and you look out over the airport, right around an airport, usually there's warehouses. And if you look at those warehouses, you'll see big, flat, open rooftops, and you say, okay, well, that's a business. And so it's going to be open in the middle of the day, maybe at home. More people are working from home, but maybe nobody's home. Maybe the kids are at school, the wife works, the husband works, and nobody's at home using that electricity. But at a business, they're open in the middle of the day. So you have a big open rooftop. You could do a large project. The business has its peak energy use occur in the middle of the day. Why isn't there a project there? Why are you more likely to see a solar array on a residential rooftop or out in a field for a utility scale project? What happened to the commercial flat rooftop market? And the answer is it got left behind. There were so many subsidies for residential and so many subsidies for utility scale, but the policy for flat commercial rooftops, the way they're billed for their electricity, even though solar is producing peak energy at peak times, the compensation for solar electricity at the commercial scale is more like the hard cost of coal, the avoided cost of energy. And so the compensation was like 20% of what the electricity was actually worth. I think that the commercial market is in for a boom. I think all the other solar market segments are declining. Utility scale's declining, residential stagnating. But as there's more functionality coming to the grid, what we see is the hurdles, the policy hurdles are being overcome by things like combining solar and batteries, and that's really promoting the new market. So we're going to talk about those concepts over the next 2 days. So this is a project that I like to point out. This project originally in 2015, the homeowner bought the project as part of a utility subsidy program. So in this one, the utility was buying the electricity for about 25% above the price of retail electricity. And so, for this client, the way that I priced, I was working for an electrical contractor who wanted to do solar. And so I said, okay, well, we want to make a lot of money off this project, so let's price it at $4 a watt. Maybe we could install it for $3.50 or $3, but at $4 a watt with the tax credit and what the customer is getting from the utility, they're going to get a 10-year payback. And the early adopters of solar are generally happy with a 10-year payback, so let's sell the array for $4 a watt. And the guy bought it and put it on his rooftop. At the same time, the guy who owns this array is very handy. He built his house as a kit. He installed his own air conditioning system. And so he said, well, I only have the money to do an 8 kilowatt project, but I have the electricity use to do a 12 kilowatt project. So can we design the array for expansion? And what we did to make the array expandable is that we designed it as if there were another row of modules here. So we left enough space for expansion. And then when we did our internal conduit run that goes back, to our point of interconnection, we sized the conduit and the breakers. And, if you were really fancy, you would just go ahead and run the cable up to the roof for that expanded circuit. We didn't do that, but, by making sure we had the breaker slots, making sure the conduit was sized, making sure our conduit run was all accessible for a retrofit. A few years later, the owner called me. I was no longer working for the electrical company. He says, I want to expand the array. Well, I went over to his house and we came up with our material list. It was a little bit hard because we were a few years out, and so we had to go back and find modules that fit the aesthetics of his original array. Modules always get a little bit larger, a little bit better each year. But the problem with expanding a solar array is that even if you use the same supplier and even the same model number, if it's an identical module, but it's just being made 3 years later, where the silicon comes from might even look slightly different. So it's very hard to get a perfect match on a expansion project. But we were actually able to find his module in a warehouse. It's what we would call obsolete modules, a few years old. So we were able to get his same modules that fit the aesthetics of his house at a pretty good price, and use some of the design techniques that we'll discuss in class to develop a material list. And so if this client went and tried to piece this together on his own, he wouldn't be able to come up with a material list as detailed as this. And the distributor that we bought the material from is a major, if you just go to Google and you Google online solar wholesaler, they're probably going to be in the top 5 that show up. Well, you call them and they say, if you are doing a residential one-off project, don't talk to us. We're trying to distribute to solar installers. Go talk to our preferred residential partner. And of course, that what that means is the price is going to go way up. We want to buy, from the best distributor we can. Well, I called up the distributor. I had never bought from them in a substantial manner. Maybe I bought 1 pallet of modules from them 3 years previously, but nothing that's going to get me any credit with them. And we're also doing a very small residential array. This is a 4 kilowatt expansion, is about as small as it gets. But because we were able to go to them with a completely designed system, not just saying, oh, we want 4 kilowatts of solar, but saying, we want 16 of these Jinko modules that you have in inventory, and we need our inverter system, and it's going to consist of 16 microinverters and 16 drop cables. And then I see that you carry this particular racking system, and so here are the quantities of the racking system with all the part numbers that you need. Within just a 15-minute conversation, they had connected me to a sales rep. I had given them the parts, they had given me the quote, and we had ordered the material, and it was all shipped. And his total project cost for this expansion, kind of acting as the construction manager, and then he provided the labor on this project himself. But again, it's a very small project. His total cost was $1.60 a watt. That's just 2 years later. If he went out for bid in the area, the pricing of this same kind of array, I wouldn't do a 4 kilowatt project for less than $3.50 a watt just because it's so small. I got to make some money off of it. And so what we see is there's a huge price swing between like what solar would cost if you just had it be more mainstream, where there's a 30% markup on your hard cost and labor. That might get you to a 250 a watt install price. But the market is still up in this 350 a watt to $4 a watt range. And it needs to come down if we want solar to be a major player in the energy market. And it is coming down. Now, this is kind of the first 6 hours of what is a longer journey into battery-based design, National Electric Code, community solar, and some solar design software. All these videos are free to you if you join the Slack community, but if you want the continuing education credit, that's when you have to register through Half Moon. And I think this quote is very useful to know. It says the three skills for a solar technician are electrical, roofing and waterproofing, and general PV system knowledge. To be perfectly honest, after I went through 4 years of mechanical engineering at the University of Pennsylvania, they have a robotics lab that's really good. It's not quite as good as MIT or Caltech or the real electrical engineering schools, but they get their DARPA funded robots, and they do drones and computer recognition and all that. And I got my job in the oil industry as a control systems engineer, designing control valves, but it's still very basic electrical scope. I didn't have I still at that point did not have a fundamental grasp of what exactly a volt was or what exactly an amp was. And I didn't know anything about National Electric Code, so maybe I could do array layouts and get everything to match up. But while you can teach yourself the general PV system knowledge, it really takes working in the trades to have a great grasp and comprehension of National Electric Code requirements and the theory behind it. Roofing and waterproofing are their own can of worms. When I got into the industry, well, I'll tell you about some of that stuff later. And then another issue is structural, where that's where my mechanical engineering experience has given me a little bit more insight on design than others in the industry. I think is because often you'll come across structures where the standard design layout, even if it works on the roof, it's not the best, and it's not necessarily the cheapest either. So just to give you an example, I'm doing work right now for a California developer, and I went and I did a site evaluation on a rooftop, and I got into the attic on this rooftop, and I looked at it was a metal roof, and on metal roofs you usually have rafters going along the rooftop, but then on top of the rafters you have purlins that go on top of the rafters, and then the sheet metal is screwed into these purlins on top. So you can't go into the rafter, you have to go into the purlin. And on this roof, we have 3 purlins and then the building wall and the roof cap. Well, generally, if you were able to fit 2 rows of solar modules along this, they would lay out, here's your top row of modules going across the roof, and here's your bottom row of modules going across the rooftop. Generally, when it comes to the racking, as you'll see in pictures over the course of the program, you get to your solar rack and you're going to run 2 rows of aluminum rail per single row of modules. I've attached them to the top and attach them to the bottom. Well, in this particular design, instead of doing 4 rows of modules and having the modules kind of stack, I apologize for my scribble, but instead of having the modules kind of be balanced right on top of these aluminum rails, what would be a much better solution is to use a shared rail system where your rail is on 3 rails instead of 4. And what would happen in a shared rail system is the bottom row of the module is actually supported all the way across on this bottom rail, and the top row and the bottom row of modules share this middle rail. And the reason why that's so much better for us in this project is we had 3 purlins that we could attach to. And so it would be very easy for our shared rail to go right on top of that middle purlin and then get into the attic and reinforce how the purlin is attached to the rafter. Whereas most solar designers, and in fact this California company, what they want me to do is put the rail like that. And I keep telling them, no, there's no place to put that rail. So if you're just using your standard practice, either the structural assessment is going to be completely wrong, and often on residential, there's no structural engineering review, which can be as dangerous as that sounds. And the thing that is making me pull my hair out of my head is that this California developer, they use a racking company that has a shared rail system in their product line, but they just don't know about it. And their distributor doesn't know about it, so they don't distribute it. And so now we have this conflict where it's use a shared rail system, it's better structurally. If I wasn't involved on that project, the structural system would be completely messed up. And on a standard pine roof with pine rafters and OSB board and shingles, the standard racking practice that we'll show you in class is perfectly fine. But not all rooftops are typical. There's a lot of metal roofs out there, and depending on the metal roof system, it's not the same as a shingle system. So the quote, in most cases, installers only have strong skills in one aspect, but not others. The electrician knows everything about code. Most of what I've learned in the industry that hasn't been self-taught has come from electricians and general contractors sharing their knowledge of general electrical and structural and roofing techniques. Someone like me is kind of dangerous because I can convince you that I know everything about a project because of my solar knowledge. I can bid you a very high price and say, oh, it's because I know what I'm doing. And then I could install a system that, maybe by now I've gotten my national electric code technique developed, but maybe I don't know the best practices for roofing and waterproofing. Maybe I don't know the best practices for structural. That's why we have division of scope, division of labor. So maybe it's actually best for the solar installer to just focus on the solar system knowledge and preparing the scope to pass off to electrical or general contracting. Sometimes the solar guys get really mad at me in my class because, what I'm saying is don't use the solar guy, use the mainstream. You still have to have a knowledge expert to assist you with that scope development. Maybe the solar guys need to be focusing more on the design phase and how to integrate construction documents into the mainstream. Okay, let's take a step back for a minute. I'm a big solar guy. My friends all hate me now because I only talk about solar. My girlfriend has to say, stop talking about solar. You're going to talk about something else other than solar. And I'm like, well, what about batteries? That doesn't work either. But I want to take a step back and think about what did we do before solar power came into being? Well, I think that it is absolutely fascinating that what we think as the oil lamp or the kerosene lamp, that lamp did not get invented until after the founding of the United States. So before the US was around, before the oil lamp was around, you basically had candles and maybe torches where you would just take some animal fat and almost like in caveman times, shove a stick into some animal fat, put in the fire, and now you have a torch. Or you have, floating oil lamps with wicks in them, like Aladdin's lamp or something like that. Or candles, and candles are, you try powering, lighting your home at night with candles, and it was more expensive back then than it is today, and it's not. Additionally, candles will put particles into the air that have health and safety impacts. And so the idea of having not just electricity at night, but even residential lighting at nighttime is a relatively new thing in the history of humanity. Not just solar versus other resources. Lighting is relatively new. There was a lot of synergy for oil in the United States. You had a lot of the expansion and discovery of the new world. They were looking for timber, and so you get a bunch of sailors sailing across the ocean, and they land on a continent that's full of trees. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to build ships. So in the early America, we were a nation of shipbuilders. And pretty soon, with that oil lamp that was invented, they're going to get on their ships and go hunt down some whales because that whale oil is very good to burn in those lamps. And so from the 1780s to the 1840s, it wasn't like a kerosene lamp. It was the same lamp, but perhaps we could spin it today by saying back then we were a society powered by free-range organic biofuel. The whales probably didn't feel that way, and literally the demand for oil outstripped the supply. And fortunately for everyone, petroleum was discovered in the 1860s, and before that, in the 1850s, they knew how to take coal and gasify it into kerosene. But it was an extremely expensive process, and we still see that today in clean coal, where if we want to gasify that beautiful clean coal, it's still as expensive today as it was, back in the day. Now, I think it's fascinating to explore what the heck people were doing for power between the 1840s and the 1860s, because unlike the whale oil boom, which was driving down the price of electricity, but before they discovered a cost-effective way to turn fossil fuel into oil that you could burn in a lamp, people didn't really know what to do with petroleum before then. And so what we had is this transition in the United States where our energy supply was under threat. Whale oil was going up, and the alternate to whale oil was biofuels like ethanol. So ethanol was around back then. It was a cottonseed and lumber derivative. You would take the turpentine from pine wood and cottonseed oil, and you would blend it with alcohol, and you could burn it. Much like today, you go and take some flammable alcohol and high proof, light it on fire. It produces a flame, sure, but it's not a very good flame. It doesn't produce very much light. Just like candles, it produces soot. It's also dangerous. It could spill and catch things on fire. And so, because the good quality, clean whale oil was getting too expensive to buy, humanity was transitioning to a cheaper but less effective and more dangerous fuel resource. And a lot of those pine trees and cottonseed came from the southern half of the United States, which in the 1840s and 1850s did not play very nicely with the north half of the United States. And so in the 1860s, when the Civil War broke out, the IRS was established to raise money for the Civil War effort. And the very first tax that they passed was a tax on alcohol that says, well, if you're going to stay home and drink booze instead of go fight in the war, you're going to pay for it. Well, that's not all it did. What that tax on alcohol, at the time, the alcohol was about 50 cents a gallon. And the tax was a $2 a gallon tax on alcohol. Well, that alcohol was not just used for drinking, it was also used to make ethanol and these alcohol blends for fluid, for fuel. And this coincided with massive discoveries of crude oil in Pennsylvania. And it was known at the time that crude oil could be used to produce kerosene. They just didn't have enough of it. So now they knew they had the supplies for fossil fuel. What they had to do was take the cheaper, less effective, bad for health and safety, and also bad for national security ethanol off the market. And so that $2 a gallon tax that increased the price of ethanol by about 500%. And guess what? That tax remained for decades after the Civil War ended. And so you could have seen this alternate universe where perhaps the southeast of the United States became the Saudi Arabia of ethanol, but instead a better technology was discovered, fossil fuels, but it was a tax policy that knocked ethanol off of the market and maybe in the 1870s fossil fuel could stand on its own 2 feet. But in the 1860s, it was that tax that kicked it over the edge. So energy taxes go way back to the original taxes of the IRS. By the 1860s, we have light bulbs and electricity because now we have all this fossil fuel. And then in the 1950s, that was when the commercial development of the solar panel first came to market. So yes, your solar cells, your silicon solar cells are now a 60-year-old technology. Well, so why is solar not everywhere? Well, you don't just use silicon for solar panels. Silicon is the most abundant, is the second most abundant element on the Earth's crust. So most of the Earth's crust is silicon dioxide. So oxygen is the number one element, silicon is the number two element. There's no shortage of silicon on Earth. It does take a lot of energy to extract that silicon from silicon dioxide, and that requires starting out with a relatively pure stock of sand, which is what silicon dioxide is. And so wherever there's really good, pure sand dunes, that's a good source for silicon. Well, silicon is not just used for solar, it's also used for computer chips. So put yourselves in the shoes of a silicon refiner in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. What are you going to do? Are you going to sell your silicon to the solar industry that has to compete with all of these other technologies? Or are you going to sell your silicon to the computer industry that is doing new, wonderful, profitable things with their computer chips? Well, obviously, you'll get higher margins if you sell your silicon to the computer industry. The solar panel and that silicon transistor that replaced the vacuum tube on computers, they came to market within a year of each other. They're Irish twins. But computers are all over the place and solar panels are not. because for the past 60 years, the computer industry has been sucking up all the silicon it possibly can and using it to make electronics. Well, what happened at the end of the 90s was there was a big crash in the semiconductor industry. And silicon refiners that had been experiencing exponential growth for decades finally saw their growth level out. And so now, that's what was driving when I went to work for Fluor in the mid 2000s and they're building silicon refineries that very much had to do with they never needed to sell their silicon to anywhere else except computer chips by and large, up until the semiconductor industry crash of the late 90s. And at that point, they said, well, let's scale up the solar industry because even though it's substantially lower margin, it's substantially higher volume. There's 1,000 times as much silicon in a solar panel as there is in a computer chip that the solar panel might energize. And so even though it's lower margin, it's higher volume. So nowadays what's happening is the silicon refining capacity is being dedicated for the solar industry, and it's all about taking refined silicon and ramping it up into effectively making solar into a commodity market. And so it's very easy to get frustrated with renewables and solar because they do ping pong around on green energy policy, and you might be asking yourself, well, is solar really only around because of the tax credit? Is solar really only around because of the subsidies? And what I would say is, for one, there is historic precedent for those tax credits and subsidies for governmental policy to shape our energy for the United States, and that is controversial. But for those who hate the controversy, there is that knowledge that the primary driver for growth in this industry has nothing to do with climate change, emission-free technology, or renewables. It has nothing to do with solar and wind versus coal and fossil fuels. It has everything to do with solar being a silicon-based technology. And for the past 60 years, that silicon has not been available for the solar industry to buy, but now the silicon refiners have changed their tune. In other words, the biggest driver of the solar industry is not governmental policy and green energy policy. The biggest driver is the fact that solar is basically a computer that's been sitting on the sidelines for 60 years and is finally at the point where it gets some playing time. And so we're really now in the era of solar dedicated silicon refining, and that's really what is driving up the industry much more so than, say, a 30% tax credit or a carbon tax or something that might affect your project margins by 30 to 60%. Back in the 1970s, the tax credit for solar was not 30% residential. It was 40% residential. It was larger than what the subsidies are today. The projects were more expensive than they are today. The subsidies were even more necessary than they are today. Solar didn't come to the market in the 70s. It fizzled out as soon as the tax credit went away. Why? Nothing to do with government policy, really. The subsidy did create that flash in a pan market and it went away. But the reason was because the silicon refiners, even when you were getting a 40% tax credit for solar, the refiners still had no incentive to change their supply chain and stop servicing the computer industry. All right, enough history. Now we're back in design. A solar panel is designed to be carried in a safe manner. So at the same time, you want to optimize your space. So a solar panel is about as big as what one person can safely carry. And at the residential level, when you're up on an elevated rooftop, that's even more important. So your typical solar panel is about 3 1/3 feet wide by 5 1/3 feet tall. There is what the industry would refer to as like a utility scale panel. And all the utility scale panel is a little bit taller. It's about 6 feet tall instead of 5 feet tall. And what this smaller solar panel, the technical term is that this would be a 60 cell panel, whereas this one would be a 72 cell panel. And so you can actually count the cells. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's where you would get to the 60 cells. And then utility scale, the only difference between the two is that utility scale says, well, our more beefy construction workers can pick up something that is a little bit taller. Instead of weighing 40 pounds, the utility scale panels weigh 48 pounds. They're 20% larger. But they're the same width. If I'm up on a rooftop, a 6 foot tall solar panel is just too much. A 6 foot tall panel, a 72 cell panel, that is almost too big to fit on a lift gate of a truck, of a delivery truck. My delivery drivers do not like it when I do 72 cell panels, because instead of fitting, one pallet, they only get, or 2 pallets, the pallet's a little bit larger, and then they get to that lift gate and it has to swing all the way out over the lift gate to lower it down onto the ground. On a utility scale project, you're using heavy equipment, forklifts, boom lifts, you might have a receiving dock. Those logistical issues you don't really run into. On the ground, picking up a 50-pound, 6 foot tall object is fine. On a rooftop, when you have to deal with your fall protection gear, the wind, the slope, it's just a little bit too much. If I'm doing a ground mount project, even if it's a residential project, I will still look at utility scale panels, because they just, if you have a rack running from east to west, a 72 cell panel is just going to fit a few more cells onto that same rack. It's going to just be slightly more cost effective. But there's nothing wrong with using 60 cell panels for a large array or 72 cell panels for a small array. It's these little minutiae of project logistics that really are the main distinguishment. And not all solar modules are 60 cell and 72 cell. That's just kind of the standards. So your standard solar module for residential and commercial purposes, about 3 1/3 feet wide, 5 1/3 feet tall. It weighs about 40 pounds. It is, the manufacturers know that solar panels go outside. They know that. And so the solar panels are rated to go outside. They're water resistant. The frames are designed to not allow water through, because that could get into the cells and degrade them. Over time, when you see module degradation, we'll talk about it in a few slides, it's the water vapor at a microscopic level getting between the glass and the frame into that energized environment, and then the energy might vaporize the water vapor, and that can cause the sheet and the cell to start to separate. It's almost like the sheet that protects the cell and the cell itself are laminated. And that lamination is perfectly smooth, and then a little air gap, a little bubble can start to have over a 30 or 40-year process, over 10,000 cycles. That little bubble can start to become a larger bubble, and eventually it might cause a fault. That So cells will degrade. It is put into their warranty. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. At the same time, the panels are designed to go outside. You know, they're rated for 1-inch hail at 50 miles an hour. Sometimes you can buy damaged modules from a utility scale project that gets hit by a hailstorm. And so solar panels are designed to take 1-inch hail at 50 miles an hour. Some are designed to take 1-inch hail at 70 miles an hour. You get into a hailstorm that's baseball-sized hail, you know, you're going to have some damage. And maybe the damage is not readily apparent. You know, that's the main problem, is that the modules may have been weakened structurally, but not enough to cause any performance issues or failure issues. And so it's almost impossible to determine, you know, after a hailstorm, you might pull up your monitoring system and think everything is hunky-dory, and then your window to file a claim might elapse. And then 5 years later, the problems might emerge. So, you know, I have seen one of these mother of all hailstorms roll through an area where I had a few solar arrays installed, and none of them seemed to be affected. This was a hailstorm where every single car in the parking lot, the window glass, the windshield glass, not just for the front window, but the back window and the sunroof too, are all just smashed clear through. The roofing contractors are throwing parties because they have 3 years of work ahead of them. You know, people are uploading the videos of the hail onto YouTube. Because your backyard swimming pools are now becoming 3-foot tall water fountains. I mean, it is a massive, massive hailstorm. I took a service call on a hail damaged solar array, and 10% of the modules were damaged by hail. 2 out of 20 modules had cracked glass because of hail in a hailstorm that would total a rooftop. Solar does protect against, solar does protect your roof. Shingles degrade because of exposure to sunlight, and your solar modules will shade your shingles. Now, at the same time, shingles are not supposed to be a construction site, and so on a retrofit, if you're clunking around up on the rooftop, you could be damaging the shingles during the install. And often a solar array won't cover the entire rooftop. And so maybe just from a rooftop longevity point of view, it would be better to cover the whole roof or the entire section of the roof and not just the optimal section, just so that section of roof remains the same in terms of its life. You know, back on the original comment, sometimes you can find utility scale arrays that have been hail damaged where only 10% of the modules no longer work, and they replace the whole array. So sometimes you can find super discounted modules that are hail damaged modules, but they still work and they're still fine. They're just the ultra discount bargain bin. You know, maybe they would be good for your own personal off-grid cabin in the woods, not something you'd really put forward to a client, although I'm sure they would take them in some markets. We'll take a look at the warranty in a minute. As far as where do you go to buy these solar modules, you just roll up your sleeves, call up a few distributors, and do some good old-fashioned pricing. Well, if I want to buy an air conditioning system, I can't just call up Carrier and buy an HVAC unit. In fact, if I really want a particular brand, like a Carrier brand air conditioner, it might be that Carrier has its own geographically controlled distribution line, and I have to go through a certified Carrier installer in order to buy that Carrier air conditioning unit. While there are some closed supply chains in the industry, and generally they're going to apply to your specialty projects like Tesla Powerwall or some, not all, but some of your high efficiency modules. The vast majority of the solar industry is not a closed supply chain network like other industries. Your distributors still do not know if it's going to be the solar installer or the mainstream electrician or the building developer or the end user who's going to be the primary buyer of these things. And so they're hedging their bets. If you go online and you find an online distributor that advertises a dealer network or dealer pricing, most of the time, just the fact that you're an engineer or an architect will qualify you for the dealer program. So it's not like a traditional where you must have this much project volume, you might pay a franchise fee or something like that. There's none of that for most of these distributors. In fact, how we found those Jinko 3-year-old solar modules at a discount is my strategy is rather than deal with signing up as a dealer with a bunch of different distributors I'm never going to order from, I'll just go online to a bunch of different online wholesalers and sign up for their newsletter. Because their newsletter is going to publish pricing that's more like the contractor pricing rather than the list pricing. And so, if I see a really good deal on some modules, it's because it's the distributor is trying to clear them out. So even if I've never bought from them before, even if I'm not in their dealer network, you call them up with a complete design, they're going to want to jump through hoops to sell you a system. Maybe you'll buy another system from them. Maybe you'll give them all your business. So, just rolling up your sleeves, searching for online solar distributors and signing up for their newsletter is a really good way to determine what the true pricing is for a solar module rather than what you might find on Amazon or eBay or the list price from a distributor. I'm not going to talk about different module technologies mainly because the module that seems to have stuck out longer than others, which is a SIGS technology. The SIGS manufacturer in the U.S., Styon, they lasted a lot longer than other manufacturers, but they've announced bankruptcy proceedings too. So, as far as different module technologies go, more than likely you're going to end up with a silicon solar module. But even so, there are aesthetic considerations. In this module on the right, this is a standard solar module. It's monosilicon. I like monosilicon. We'll get into reasons in a little bit. But you have this silver frame, you have your blue cells, and then you have this white supporting substrate. It's a plastic sheet. Well, instead of a silver frame, you could have a black frame. It's anodized silver. It can be anodized black for hardly a difference in price. Instead of a white back sheet, they can have a black back sheet. And what that's effectively going to do is hide the cells. We'll show you a better picture because this is kind of misleading. The SIGS panel is a more universal cell going all the way from the top of the module to the bottom. It's just not, silicon has won the economic battle. So we'll talk about some aesthetic differences in just another slide or two. But essentially, when you look at different module technologies, the vast majority of the market is either monosilicon or polysilicon. The difference being with monosilicon, where you have these cells, the monosilicon, it's a little confusing, but you get a cylinder of silicon. And this is not actually a cast in place ingot. It's actually a crystal. like your old grow a crystal in your bathroom at home, science kit you would play with as a kid. This is a vat of liquid that has some stripped out silicon ions into it. And in your upstream refining process, they grow a single uniform crystal of silicon, and then they slice it up. And that creates a very pure cell, which is great for quality. It creates a very efficient cell, which is great for quality, but it also produces a lot of sawdust, and so that's not particularly good for cost. Polycrystalline is a little bit different. The vat of ions that they use to grow the cell is actually a sheet or a tray, and the silicon just kind of grows in a square sheet, but its grain boundary is all random. And so they might have a fleckled appearance. Usually it's a lighter shade of blue. And they're just slightly less efficient than monosilicon. But then again, when they slice and dice the sheet, it's more like a square pizza instead of a pepperoni. And so it's less material waste. And so additionally, with a square cell, they get rid of these little diamonds. They can fill in more space on the module. And so the end result is the efficiency of polysilicon is not that much different than monosilicon because it's a lower efficiency cell, but it covers more surface area of the module. So the net production difference is very close together and the manufacturing process is cheaper. And so polysilicon is the dominant market, but monosilicon is still catering, what I would say is the United States market, where your consumers will be able to afford and pay for a higher quality cell. And then maybe the cheaper polysilicon is what they're buying in Mexico. Because if I'm going to go through the process of doing an import tariff on my module, I might as well go for the most space efficient module possible, the one that's going to be the top quality, because if I have to overcome these upfront costs, I'm only going to do that as far as a long-term project goes. I don't really care about monosilicon versus polysilicon versus other kinds of module technologies. What is more important in my mind is aesthetics, which is neglected. Now, I think aesthetics are particularly important for residential arrays because when you deal with 10 or 12 year paybacks, you might have a transition in ownership in the house. And, or you might be in a market like Mississippi where the energy savings is so low and the market is so small that the install costs are so high that the national average might be a 12-year payback for solar. In Mississippi, it might be a 15-year payback or even a 20-year payback if you just look at what you spent and the money you get out of it. Residential home value is not that refined. It's not going to appraise your solar array in the same way that a CPA might assess the cash flow of an investment. Instead, when it comes time to sell your home, the amount of value that the array adds to your home is not the net present value of the remaining electricity left in the array. The value that the array adds to the home is set by what the new home buyer will spend on the home above and beyond what they would normally spend because it has solar. And that might be more than the cost savings of the array. It may also be less than the cost savings of the array. If you have a lease and that solar array was leased at a very high above market rate price, it might be a cost effective solar lease, but the new home buyer would say, no, I don't want it, because even if I buy out that lease, I'm spending way more on a solar array than what I would spend on a brand new array. So I don't want to buy a home with a solar lease. And at that point, your solar array is actually reducing the value of the home, even though it's a $40,000 asset that might have been financed such that it saves the customer a little bit of money each month. And so that can be very aggravating, because the homeowner says, well, the lease is saving you money, it should increase the value of my home, but they find that the buyer pool has shrunk. And so what I think is very important is to understand that if the solar array does not look good, you are not doing your residential client with a long-term payback a good service. If this is you can see this designer, they tried to do everything right. They designed an array that was going to be a uniform polygon. And this array is on the rooftop. So you can say, well, I don't really see my roof. Well, you do if you go and walk 100 feet away and then you turn around, you can still see the rooftop. And it's that curb appeal that sets the value of the asset. The home buyer pulls up curbside, they look at the rooftop, they see the solar array, and they say, oh, that's a green home with low electric bills. And it depends on the home too. If you're building I've done a 3 kilowatt solar array that would save like $500 a year in electricity. And then a 3 kilowatt solar array on a $5 million home that was like 8,000 square feet. The owner of the home was the owner of multiple luxury car dealerships. His garage was a 12-car garage with a lift on every car bay. So you could actually have 24 cars in his garage, and in that garage was a Rolodex of all the luxury cars you can think of. I mean, it was a great garage to just look around in. You had a McLaurin in the garage. He didn't care about the solar array. When I met this guy once, when he introduced me to his project manager, and he said, I don't really care about this array. It's for my wife. My wife wants the solar array, so I'm going to get one. We're not going to put it on the house. We're going to put it on the boat dock. And that was the last I saw of him. And then you do have that luxury client there. That's not mainstream. That's not most. So we can see that this designer has tried to do everything right. They got all black modules. They got an all black frame. They have a nice even polygon. But what they missed out on was this black plumbing vent that is poking through the roof right there. So you can see some other black vents. So the designer is obviously of the home is obviously interested in aesthetics, but the solar designer missed that black vent. And so you can see the install, the module was supposed to go there, and instead they kind of tacked it on to the end there. So they took what would have been a perfect array and then kind of made it look like it needed a trip to the orthodontist to fix. But in general, when you're doing residential arrays, what are preferred are what are called all black modules, where they take that metal frame and they make it black, and they take that back sheet and they make it black. And what that does is it just has a muted effect on the metal lines and the circular cells, which you can kind of make out in this picture. They're there, they're just hidden. And so generally when I'm doing residential, I'm doing all black modules because it looks better. Not always. I kind of miss the aesthetics of solar, of these monosilicon silver frame modules. They look really good on metal rooftops to have that blue and aluminum, where the aluminum kind of matches the color of the metal of the steel roof. But that I'm a solar junkie. I love solar panels, and as they say, black never goes out of style. So even though the all black modules might cost 0.25% more, maybe they'll produce 0.25% less energy because they're black, and so they absorb a little bit more heat. But they're what the customer wants in terms of aesthetics, is all black modules. And in fact, this installer, where they encounter the plumbing vent there are options now to overcome plumbing vents on the rooftop that aren't in very good places. You don't have to do like with this design where they encounter the vent and so they just quite obviously slide the array over, and they tried to make it okay by keeping the modules kind of in line, but this, it doesn't look okay. It doesn't look good. And so you could, space the array out so that you're going around the vents, but then those vents will be casting shadows that will impact you. And so this is where like the building design technique comes in to say, well, what are plumbing vents really doing poking out of the rooftop? And they do two things. The first thing, the most important thing, the primary thing they do are not to release noxious gases from the sewer out the roof of your house. That's not the goal of these plumbing vents. The goal is to give you exposure to atmosphere so that when you flush the toilet, the water goes down the drain, and you don't create a vacuum that, like a straw with water in it where you hold the top of the straw. The drain is there, but the water doesn't want to go down the drain. The plumbing vents are the top of the straw. And so what's important with your plumbing vents is that they don't get covered up. But if you actually had a plumbing vent coming out of the roof and you covered it with a solar module, there's still a little 1-inch gap in this module frame. You're still going to have that exposure to ATM. So your plumbing vents will work if you, say, gave this, not an oven vent, not a chimney vent, a plumbing vent. If you gave it a little haircut, it would work. It might be a local code violation. Maybe your installer, maybe your inspector will allow you if you talk with them. Most inspectors, if I say, hey, can I cut off the top of your plumbing vents? They're going to be like, no. And who are you? And what's your license number? But if I go to that inspector and I say, here's an article that talks about plumbing vents where it's about exposing it to the atmosphere. And so this plumbing vent that is concealed underneath the solar array, it's still exposed to atmosphere and it's going to work. In fact, it's going to be safer because what I'm basically doing is putting a vent cap on top of the plumbing vent. And so now, snow or debris can't clog that vent like it used to. So I'm actually improving project safety. And furthermore, when you poke a plumbing vent hole in the roof, it does weaken that decking. And by, if I just do what a solar designer will do conventionally, I take this array and then I go and I land my last attachments of my rail right next to the plumbing vent instead of going over it and bridging it. The solar rail actually will stiffen your rooftop. And so if I'm weakening the service board by putting a plumbing vent hole in there, adding additional bracing that goes around that cladding and secures it to the rafter and covers it up and protects it, that's actually improving the structural integrity of the home and the integrity of that vent. It should not be a code violation. And that's where, being a professional general contractor who has a good relationship with a local inspector, they're much more likely to hear you out under that circumstance. The solar designer who doesn't want to challenge that assumption is just going to land the edge of their array right next to that vent. And guess what? The edges of your array have higher loads than the panels that are on the interior of the array. And so now we're putting a higher load on this attachment point, and it's going to be vibrating the decking up and down right around that plumbing vent. Guess where your leak is going to be? Your leak is not going to be on this newly made flashed sealed solar penetration. The leak is going to be at that pre-existing penetration. And the solar installer might say, well, that's not my scope. Except when they were installing this array, they were tromping, all along where this plumbing vent is. And then they installed an attachment that's shaking that cladding up and down for 30 years. You're almost inviting a leak by ending your array right next to a plumbing vent as opposed to covering it up. So then there's a second reason why we have plumbing vents, and that second reason is, in fact, that you will have some sewer gas go up the vent rather than down into the sewer. And we have these plumbing vents. The code on the plumbing vents is such so that gas, goes up into the air instead of collecting on the rooftop. And maybe instead of going up the roof, it might go down the roof and into a window. We give this elevation a little bit of a distance, a little bit of a gap to keep it away from entering the building. Maybe there's a slight corrosive effect that putting a plumbing vent directly underneath a solar module could have on that module. To me, I say, well, the aesthetics are more important than one module being corroded because of gas 10 or 15 years down the line. If that happens and there's a fault in that module, we'll just replace the module. No big deal. But on top of that, now there are, another option, and this did not exist before the solar industry, but now we have a vent system where you can cap and flash and seal this venting system where you cut the top of the vent off and then replumb it out the top of the solar array. And so, that replumbing a piece of PVC pipe up on a rooftop is a very simple task. But that is that chasm that the solar designer may not be able to bridge, is understanding that general building comprehensive knowledge, and that results in ugly solar at the very least, and perhaps structurally unsound solar under your worst case scenario. And so, the hubris of the solar installer who knows everything, there might be a blind spot there that says maybe there is a reason for a general building designer to not make that mistake. Snow guards. There are snow guards on solar arrays. The main problem with snow on solar arrays is actually it's very preventable, but it also has to do with structural engineering. Everyone knows, hey, this is a sleek surface, and so when snow falls off a solar array, it's going to avalanche off the rooftop. And so snow guards on a metal roof, they might put some attachment at the bottom of the roof, so to prevent those avalanches. Well, so here's our snow guard, and it doesn't look like a rail that goes across the roof. It just looks like a little piece of metal that's, look, it's not even at the bottom of the array. This is not going to keep the snow from sliding, avalanching off the array. It's going to keep the snow up on top of the array. Well, isn't that a bad thing? Because don't we want the solar array to be clear of snow? So it produces energy? Well, yes. The problem with snow is that when you have an interconnected rack like this, like you see in the pictures in front of you, where you have the rail going across and then the modules are clamped to the rail. And so basically this is one big integrated rectangle. All the snow, it begins to slide. And so now you have an uneven weight distribution where there's more weight on the bottom of this array than there is on the top of the array. And so when you're in an area of heavy snow, what you want to do, and we have some slides on this a little bit later, so I'm just going to state it briefly here. What you want to do is reinforce the attachments along the bottom of the array. Instead of going every 4 feet, put a new attachment in, on the very bottom row, you may just want to do every 2 feet, do an attachment so that there's less weight per attachment, so that when you get these heavy snow mounds, the failure is that you get so much weight up on the array that the bottom rail crushes through the roof deck. And that can be easily addressed by just adding a few more supports, which the solar installer doesn't really want to do, because that means they have higher material costs and more time spent on the roof, and they're not roofers. And they're being asked to identify where there are rafters underneath the roof to anchor to. And they know that, unless the building is built perfectly under a retrofit, they're going to be putting down some attachments that aren't going to go into the rooftop. And that's no big deal when you miss a rafter. You have your sealant gun with you, and so you can feel that you do what you can not to miss. First off, there's a couple of different techniques, but basically the installer is going to be tapping the rooftop, measuring off 2 feet on center, and then realizing if they got something wrong, because you can feel it. The attachment doesn't bite into the rafter; it bites into the decking, and it'll wobble a little bit more. That's all right. You just remove it, seal it. Hopefully you get it right the second time. But they don't want to do that, every 2 feet on center across the rooftop. And because there's very little structural oversight of residential systems in particular, that can get skipped over. And then only in areas of heavy snow does that become a problem. Rodent skirts. This is another thing that your solar project financiers don't want to spring for. It's like, okay, well, we're doing a $30,000 solar project and the surrounding trees are riddled with squirrels, but you don't want to spend the extra $400 to put an array skirt, what's called an array skirt, around the array to prevent the squirrels from getting under there. So some of that stuff doesn't make sense. And that's where maybe a quality installer can distinguish themselves. Yeah, I'd say most solar installation companies do not use array skirts. The developer I'm doing projects for, I can tell them in the site evaluations, the customer shoots squirrels off of his rooftop with a BB gun, and they still don't put it into the budget. I'm working on my own system. It might be that the array skirt systems, they all come from bird guards. And squirrels are a little bit more industrious than birds. So maybe maybe the array skirts that are on the market are not very good. What I'm experimenting with is just cable trays, metal screens, locating the wiring underneath the array, how you orient the modules to fully enclose all the roof-mounted wiring and electronics up on the rooftop rather than defending the perimeter. So a squirrel might be able to peel one little panel off, and now they have a mansion that they can live inside of. And so maybe the developer is saying, well, since we can't fully beat the squirrels, we're not going to do anything about it. There's definitely some still room for product innovation in the industry on that. But generally, you're going to want to put in an array skirt if there are if you already have squirrels on the rooftop, you're going to want to put in an array skirt. Well, if the squirrel chews on a wire that's hot, aren't they going to learn very quickly not to do that? Well, yes, but at night, there's no power in the wires. They could completely chew up your entire solar array, and I've seen it happen before. It's not a fun process to fix. Okay, well, what about the module warranty? Now, I always take module warranties with a grain of salt. And this is because solar is very reliable. The International Space Station is powered by solar, and I'm pretty sure that a service call in outer space is quite expensive. So sometimes you can see solar being attacked because it's not reliable. Solar is very reliable. The sun is going to be here much longer than the Earth. So, we know the sun is there. The weather, the volatility of production can vary. The reliability of solar is very good. I have, let's see how many. I've installed maybe 4,000 solar modules, and I've replaced maybe 8 solar panels that have failed in the field over time, either right on startup or a few years later. And I have to say, on those failures, we'll talk about failures on this slide, but the failures that do exist, they're very rare. And I believe that most modules fail due to handling issues and field-related issues, and aren't necessarily manufacturing driven. The reliability is very good on solar modules. Now, what the warranty looks like, there are some differences. Now, when I got into the solar industry, the standard warranty was for 80% of the rated power of the module over a 25-year basis. And so if the module degraded by more than 20% at the point over that 25 years, then it would trigger the warranty. Now, this is where it gets dicey as well. What happens when that warranty is triggered? And it really depends at that point on your manufacturer and your installer and the distributor and the relationships they have. Now, on my larger commercial projects or those $4 a watt installs that are sold at a high market rate, they've all gotten their warranties serviced. The installer, a module fails, the installer, is buying from one manufacturer, and they say, well, on your next shipment, we need some of these modules because we've had a couple failures, and they work it out. If you're just doing a little small one-off project, you say, well, hey, I have a warranty event, it's actually going to be very difficult to get it serviced for a few reasons. One, the manufacturer will say, okay, well, we've given you an 80% warranty, and the module has degraded by 79%. So here's a check for the difference. And get out of the warranty that way. They may say, well, you need to field verify that the degradation is there, and so you need an installer with fancy voltage curb testing, and it's just not something that the average homeowner, even the average residential installer, is going to be able to do. Now, I don't really worry too much about all of this. And the reason is not just reliability, but when you have a 60 cell solar module and you have these 60 cells going, from top to bottom, they're solar cells. Generally speaking, they're on 3 bypass circuits. And so if you have a fault on one module, it drags down the performance of the module by 2/3. And so no matter what kind of warranty you have, if you have a problem with your solar module, generally it's producing way down here, producing about 2/3 what it should be. And what happens generally is a little soldered connection on the module has failed. And so did that soldered connection fail because of the build quality of the module, or was it because 5 years previously the installer slammed the module down on the rack a little too hard? Maybe someone kneeled or sat on the module and the pressure rating of the module says it can take it, and it did, and it didn't break and nothing went wrong, but 5 years later that little stress fracture finally popped open a solder point. But the point is, you're generally not debating the degradation of the array when you're servicing a warranty. Usually when you're servicing a warranty, it's very obvious that there's you've lost 30% or more of the production. But let's talk about the warranties. When I got in, it was 80%, 25 years, and your higher quality manufacturers gave you also a 90% performance warranty for 10 years. So you got kind of this stair step warranty. 10 years, 90%, 25 years, 80%, or something very close to that. Now, solar modules actually degrade a little bit differently in the first year than in years 2 through 25. So in the first year, it's kind of like you buy a new car and you roll it out of the dealer lot and it has that new car smell and the engine is perfect with no gunk in it and you're getting the rated mileage. But after a year, the engine has some stuff in it, the new car smell is faded, and the mile per gallon rating of the car has dropped a little bit. You have a similar, and that's because the engine has gunk in it. There's more friction, there's more degradation. You have a very similar thing happening with solar in the first year of operation. In the first year of operation, imagine solar is like a pool table, a billiards table. And so here's your billiards table, and here's your side pockets, and you have perfectly green felt, and here's your triangle with your pool balls, and then when you use your cue ball, and in our analogy, the cue ball is that energy particle of light that breaks the rack, and then all of your electrons go off in every direction, and some of them go into the pocket. And so that's kind of the same thing with solar. You have light hit the cell, and the electrons in the cell get broken out of where they're supposed to go. In the pockets in the solar module are actually, we trick the electrons. Rather than, when the electron leaves where it's supposed to go where it originally was, it leaves behind a hole. And that hole wants to suck an electron. But what we do is we coat the top of the cell and the bottom of the cell in dissimilar elements, and it sucks all the electrons up to the top of the cell. But you still have all those holes that want to draw electrons down. And so what we do is we complete a circuit from the top of the cell to the bottom of the cell, and all the electrons that are kind of stuck to the top flow through the circuit and then end up back where they should be. And the process repeats each day as sun energizes those electrons and knocks them out of the cell. Okay, well, back to our analogy. we have our pool table, and we have our perfect rack of modules and our cue ball and our side pockets. But over time, these pool balls that are ricocheting everywhere, they're going to leave behind channels in the felt. And the felt is going to have little gutters in them. So the next time the cue ball hits that ball and it bounces off the wall and it bounces off the wall, it's going to fall in to that channel in the felt. And the same thing with these electrons. They leave channels in the silicon. And so instead of the electron ricocheting with most of its momentum, once these channels are established in the silicon, once the solar module loses its new car smell, it's going to see a little bit of degradation in the first year because now there's a little bit more friction inside that solar panel. All right, so that's going to be maybe 1% to 2% loss in the first year. Is for a couple of reasons. Some of the electrons in the past, this year one degradation has been more critical because the electrons will actually leak out of the grounding system, whether it be the inverter ground or the ground between the module frame. The modules will leak out of the system and never return, and that's going to drag down your system efficiency. Those leaky issues have been changed. They've changed the way that the inverter detects ground faults so that it's more doing current monitoring rather than like a fuse. And so it, instead of negatively grounding the DC side of the inverter, they leave it floating. And so they remove the ground points. They've taken the cells and they've expanded simply by, the manufacturers got a little too greedy and they started putting the cells of the modules a little bit too close to the frame of the module, and that voltage potential would be enough to push some of the electrons out of the frame. Not enough to electrocute you, not enough for you to notice, but enough to drag down the module performance over time. So manufacturers have not only put in a little bit more of a gap between the cells and the module frame, but they've also fixed the inverter grounding so the degradation is not as apparent as it used to be. In your worst case scenario, in your solar modules installed in 2008 to 2014, you would see as much of as a 5% loss in the first year. And the way that we wire our modules, sometimes that 5% loss can reduce the whole system by up to 5%. So a lot of that year one degradation has been addressed. Now from year 2 to year 25, you have a different kind of degradation. And that has more to do with just the build quality of the module, how weatherproof it is. And even if you have a module that instead of a glass top and a plastic back with the cell wedged in between, you might have a glass top and a glass back, and it might be a thinner cell. And so it's a tighter build quality. And so they say, well, our modules our thin film modules are more weatherproof than our silicon modules, and so they'll have less degradation. And that can be true until they eventually begin to degrade. And sometimes that, if something's supposed to be weatherproof and it isn't, at that point it can degrade faster than something that's a little bit more breathable. So, sometimes you have a glass top sheet and a plastic back sheet, or a glass top sheet and a glass back sheet. And as far as which is better for degradation, it's still controversial in the industry on which is better. I've seen journals talk about both being better, and that comes down to, well, higher quality manufacturers have better build quality. And that's not always the US manufacturers, because those US manufacturers have much smaller production facilities and less budget to upgrade their equipment with. So it's not always the US modules that are the best. But eventually, between the top of the cell and the bottom of the cell, or the top of the module, the bottom of the module, and the cell in between, you're going to get air and water molecules working their way between that sandwich and causing cavities to emerge. And those cavities can open up the voltage, reduce your current flow. And that degradation is about 0.5% per year. And so we see this kind of logarithmic decay curve where in the first year, we're going to see a drop down of a couple percentage points. And then from there on out, it's going to be about 0.5% a year. And so now the warranties have adjusted and they say, okay, well, it used to be 90% year 10 and then 80% year 25. Many manufacturers now and your top quality manufacturers will give you a year by year by year by year by year warranty level. Usually it's at 0.7%. So they say our warranty is in the first year, we're going to warrant 97%. And then we'll cap the degradation at 0.7% a year thereafter. And that's a really good warranty. Because I guess the danger is this year one degradation where, if your module degrades by 5% in the first year, but you only have a 90% year one warranty, you're not going to be able to service that warranty until year 8 or year 9 when that degradation finally dips down below where it's supposed to be. And that's really, not only is that tedious, it's incredibly rare. So it just doesn't happen. And so when I'm looking at module spec sheets and I want to determine which manufacturer has better finances, which manufacturer has a better product, which, generally I'll look at the warranty. And so if they give me a year by year by year by year by year warranty, that makes me more comfortable. I say, okay, well, if there is a problem, I don't have to wait until the manufacturer is out of business for it to trigger the warranty. I can trigger the warranty as soon as the problem occurs. But again, it's almost doing you a disservice to spend time on this stuff, because most of the time the warranty issue is way down here, way off the chart at like 2/3 of what the module should be doing. So whether or not you have a year-over-year warranty or more of a stair-step warranty, on the one hand, it indicates quality. On the other hand, the warranty really doesn't matter that much, because in almost all cases, either a stair-step warranty or a year-over-year warranty is going to be perfectly fine to have the warranty event trigger. And then it becomes just a problem of, well, is the premium for the premium module actually worth it? If you're really never going to use the warranty anyway, if it's just going to be cheaper for all parties involved to have one extra solar module in case something happens to one module, if something's happening to all the modules, you're going to scrap the array anyway. So how you economize the warranty, you have to take that with a grain of salt. The way I look at it is that the modules fail much less than the inverters. And so I don't really look too closely at modules. If I get a great price on a Chinese module manufacturer, we were talking about module failure on this slide. And what we have is there's been some kind of fault here, and that fault has caused, these are actually little electrical pathways of fault lines, and we can kind of see that this thin film module is very uniform in manufacturing, and it's resulted in this very symmetrical expansion of this fault. And eventually what this is it's a gap between the top of the module and the cell underneath. And so eventually that could peel the module apart if it doesn't, if the module remains otherwise conductive. It could eventually cause a fault by the module actually peeling apart. Now, in a polysilicon cell where the grain lines are more kind of fleckled and random, we see asymmetrical fault. And what this is actually, it's the silicon cell itself kind of splitting, almost like a zipper, where it's pulling apart. And now all of a sudden you have open voltage between one side of the cell and the other, and maybe the electrons can flow the other way and take the other path, and that works. And so what these are called are snail trails, and when you see them on modules, particularly the ones that were made prior to 2016, when almost no one knew about these things, you just don't care about them because the modules still work. But they are faults that could cause problems over time. And that's why I like monosilicon cells, is because when you have a completely uniform cell, you get fewer of these snail trail issues. With thin film, it's a newer manufacturing process, and the thin film tech hasn't shown to be cost effective, with the exception of First Solar, which is a US manufacturer, and they really only service the utility scale market. So for most solar designers, thin film is just not something you're going to do. It's going to be a choice between polysilicon and monosilicon. And because you have a more uniform cell boundary with monosilicon, you're less likely to get these kind of micro cracks and micro faults in your modules, which may, but usually does not impact electrical performance, at least when they occur. Now, whenever I see snail trails in a module, that's when I say, okay, well, let's pull up the monitoring system. Or, that's when you say, okay, well, the array is 5 years old, so let's do a more thorough inspection to make sure every module's or every circuit's doing what it should be, and we're not in a warranty situation. Whereas this module maybe was hit by a truck or a forklift, or I think in this particular one, it was a storm where a giant tree branch just rammed into the module. This is the glass has failed rather than the cell itself. And so all else being equal, monosilicon is usually not any more expensive than polysilicon. You just have to perhaps be a little patient for it. It might be a little bit shorter in supply, but it will result in a higher quality install if you use mono. So my preference, while I'm not wed to any particular module, my preference is for all black monosilicon just as a default module selection. Okay, well let's talk about some design. Now it comes down to fitting the solar module on the roof. And when I approached, this is Half Moon's building in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. We did an array for them back in 2014, and then later we did a residential array for them. When I look at a roof like this, I love it. For a solar designer, a big, boring, empty, open rooftop is perfect. The architects, they have a different opinion on things. They like to stagger up the rooftop. But you have to remember, every time you stagger a roof, if this section of the rooftop were higher than the other section, when you put more dimensions into your rooftop, you're dividing up this wide open space, and you're putting in spaces where you can't fit a module. So a dull, boring roof is great for solar. And I'd say maybe that's one advantage that Mississippi has over other locations, is that our rooftops are generally simple, and that makes them good job sites for solar. But the simple game in array layouts is how many 3 1/3 feet by 5 1/3 feet rectangles can you just kind of tile along the rooftop, and once you get your idea of your system array layout, then you do your system size and your inverter selection and wiring selection from there. But as far as the game of how many polygons can you fit into this larger polygon goes, or how many rectangles fit in the polygon, that's pretty simple stuff to determine your final array size. I might look. One thing we did with Half Moon's array is that their door of their building was actually slightly off center from the edge of the building. It was like maybe 1 foot to the left. And so the question becomes, well, you probably, it's do you center the array to the building, or do you center the array to the doorway? And maybe your top of the line solar installers will say, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll put the center of this, this might be the center of the array right here, but we'll put the center of the module right in front of the doorway so that it looks nice and square for your sight lines. Those are the kind of level that I like to go to kick it up a notch. And for this kind of process, Google Earth is a great tool. And what we're going to learn about is rooftop clearances in just a minute. But in most jurisdictions, you're not going to go all the way to the edge and all the way to the top. You don't want to go all the way top anyway, because generally you have a roof cap. And so you don't want to put your modules all the way up to the roof cap, or they won't fit. There's some code clearances that we're going to talk about. Mainly these clearances come from fire code, but there's also some loading considerations. But in general, Google Earth is a very easy to use, very good tool. Just as an example, here's Google Earth, and we'll put in Half Moon. We'll go over to Half Moon's project site, and Google Earth is very accurate. I can look at this roof and I can say, okay, well, there's a little here's a little penetration, a little vent here. We got our, if I wanted to say, well, how big are these skylights? I can actually take the ruler tool on Google Earth and say, okay, well, let's click there and click there. And that's about a 3-foot skylight or so. So I can measure how far from the edge of the roof the skylights are. I can measure, I can say, okay, well, this roof surface is 107 feet long. The entrance to the building is 52 or 53 feet from the left, and then the building is about 54 feet, or about 53 feet from the left of the building, about 54 feet from the right of the building. You can measure out your roof dimensions, but because we are staying, not going all the way to the edge, but because we're giving ourselves a little bit of wiggle room here, even if your dimensioning on Google Earth is off by 6 inches, if you give yourself space, it's going to fit. If you're trying to use up every single square inch of rooftop, it might not fit. you might cause a mistake. So I really like using Google Earth. I'm a big fan of remote site evaluations, actually not visiting site to until I'm ready to construct. And Google Earth, as long as you're not being aggressive in your design, is perfectly sufficient to that. I like using Google Earth to estimate tree height. Well, how do you do that? Well, in Google Earth, you get, not only can you measure out the roof, you can measure out the length of a shadow. And so we can see pretty readily that with Half Moon Site, there's no trees around, but we might want to say, well, how tall is the building? And I can see the length of this shadow here. In terms of building height, I can even see that this part of the building is a little bit taller than that part of the building, and that shadow is a little bit longer than that shadow. So how do I convert shadow length to the height of the building or the height of a tree? Well, down here in the bottom, I can't really make it any larger, but I actually get the date that this image was taken. So if I turn on, like, Google has a 3D view for 3D buildings. I'm not sure why it's usually when I click this 3D layer, it changes things. Let's take it off and put it back on. I don't know. I guess that's a moot point. Here in Google Earth, down at the bottom, you actually get the date that the picture was taken. And so we know the date that the picture was taken. We also know the length of the shadow. But on top of that, the ruler tool will not just tell you the length, it'll also tell you the bearing. So we can see this shadow is at 160 degrees off north, which means it's 20 degrees off south. And so I can go to this half moon picture. If I want to get the estimated height of the building, I can go and measure that shadow length to be, 12 and a half feet or so. And this is great for trees because you don't have to be exact with trees. The reason being, this is where it's a higher level debate, not just for tree height. Is remote site assessment good enough for design? And while you can't capture everything, and some of it depends on how well you can work with your client to gather site data, for things like building height, for tree height, well, the trees grow over time. So even if you show up and do the most stringent three-dimensional on-site assessment with digital cameras and stitching together the horizon view into a 3D analysis, well, 5 years later, the tree is going to grow. So if you didn't accommodate for the new height of the tree, then your design is going to be messed up anyway. So it could be that even the most thorough on-site shade analysis is insufficient and you have to put assumptions on top of that. But just to get a general idea of the building height or the general idea of the tree height, I use the date stamp and the bearing of this shadow. And then I'll pull up, I'll just go to Google. I'm going to Google sun angle azimuth chart. And I like the navy, so I'm going to put the link in the chat here. But basically, I can go and put in, and I can say, okay, well, this photo, this one's easy. The shadow goes straight back. So this photo was taken at high noon. This is in Starkville, Mississippi, and the shadow's at 160 degrees, and the date stamp is on November 24th, 2012, and I want to estimate this tree height. So I've measured the shadow to be 80 feet long, and then I'll go to my sun angle azimuth chart, and I'll go in and I'll put in the date that the Google photo was taken, so that would be November 24th of 2012, and I'll go put in my hometown, or it's not my hometown, I'm from Texas, but it's where I'm living right now, of Starkville, Mississippi. I'll click compute table, and here's a chart of where the sun is for every 10-minute interval in Starkville, Mississippi on November 24th, 2012, which is when this photo was taken. And so if I know that my bearing is 160 degrees, I'll go and look at my sun angle chart and scroll down to 160 degrees. And I'll say, okay, well, this Google Earth photo was taken at 10:30 a.m. and the sun was 33 degrees up in the sky at that time. And so if I know that this angle is 33 degrees and I know that my shadow length is 80 feet, I can get the estimated height of that tree, and then I can add some additional footage to it to account for future tree growth. You know, knowing what the tree is, knowing the height of the tree, like all that stuff, I guess could assist your model and make it more accurate. But the fundamental is, here in Mississippi, I can determine the height of nearby trees just by using the free online resources that are available without even getting into commercial modeling software that does all this stuff in a more automated fashion, which we'll get into. Coming back to our array layout, we need to be aware of fire code. And there are exemptions to this. In fact, in New Jersey, the fire marshal says we're not sending our firemen on top of the roof of any home that is burning down. You know, firemen will get up on the roof and cut a hole to ventilate smoke out of the building. Now, there's other ways you can do this, and perhaps the smart home way is in your attic, you put a fan, and it's called forced ventilation, and you force the air out of the attic rather than cutting a hole. Well, if that's not part of your backup power system, that can be a little hard to do during an emergency. But you can get around this fire code rule if you put in a forced air ventilation system. So you can go, this is not a hard, fast rule. You can go all the way to the edge of the rooftop if you have a forced air ventilation system, or if you're in New Jersey, or if you get approval on your permit and the local inspector knows it. Generally what happens, it's the other way around. The solar designer doesn't know the fire code clearances and then makes a mistake because they don't check. And in areas like New York, where you have row homes, or Philadelphia, where you have row homes, on a commercial rooftop, the clearance requirements are more stringent. And it generally comes down to a slanted roof will follow the residential restrictions, and a flat roof will follow the commercial restrictions. For residential, it's 3 feet off the sides and 3 feet off the top. They don't really care about the bottom. You know, basically what they want is for a fireman to be able to get up on the roof, walk up to the top, be able to cut a 3 foot by 3 foot square into the rooftop. And then if this part of the building is now on fire, they can get off, you know, that roof on the same surface. So, you know, some solar designers will be like, well, that's what the other side of the roof is for, so they can use the other side of the roof. Well, it might not be street accessible. The other side of the roof might be on fire, and you might put solar on the other side of the roof, even if it is north facing, for a couple of reasons. One, it's less efficient, but you get more energy. Two, by doing a larger array, you're not doubling your project costs. There's there are economies of scale, mobilization costs, stuff like that, that make larger arrays less costly per unit than smaller arrays. So even though that north side of the roof might be less productive, it might be cost effective to double your array size and use both sides. Three, the homeowner may want to go off grid in the future, so that raw production does have value to someone who wants to go off grid or not use grid energy. Four, your shingles degrade by exposure to the elements. So if you only put solar on one side of your roof and not the other, your rooftops will degrade at different rates. And so are you going to replace only half your roof, or are you going to replace the whole roof? There are reasons to cover the whole roof with solar and not just one section. A good reason not to is you run out of money and you need to dial it back a little bit. But the general fire code for residential type roofs is 3 feet off the sides and 3 feet off the top. Now, there are non-fire code reasons to abide by this 3 feet off the sides, 3 feet off the top clearance. One reason is that you want the solar array, it's not code required, but you want the solar array to be accessible. In fact, it is code required that, your little junction box be accessible. And I really like it doesn't have to be readily accessible. It can be covered up by a solar module, and you have to remove the clips of the module to pull the module off to get to the box underneath. I love putting boxes underneath the array because then I do a internal wire run to run my wires back to wherever they need to be. And keeping all the wires underneath the array, it just makes it look so much better. It gives the solar array that hovering appearance where it just kind of magically sits on the rooftop. A lot of solar installers, they're not electricians. They don't know general construction. They don't want to go into the attic. And so they'll just install the array and then just run all the wires off the side of the building, and it looks bad. I like doing internal wire runs. Often the internal wire runs cost less than the external ones because, if your interconnection's on the other side of the building, you're going to have an ugly piece of conduit going over the top of your building? Well, some installers do that. You're going to run conduit over the side of the building and then around and over. Why not just go into the attic and then go out the other side of the attic? Internal wire runs are something that a regular electrician will confidently and competently perform. But 3 feet off the sides, 3 feet off the top, the bottom part doesn't matter. It's just so that the firemen can get up on the roof and get down another side. But then again, serviceability of the array is important. If I do have to replace this module, what I would do is I would put my ladder, here, and then walk up the side of the roof and walk along the array and then kind of lean over the array and unbolt it and then carefully pry that module up. And then I'd set it over on the side here and then do whatever wiring underneath the module I need to do. And there are electronics that can be located underneath these modules. So it's not really a rare task to get up on a rooftop and have to remove one solar module. Well, if I don't have anywhere to place this module, now I have to have two people on site so that the other person can, hold the module so that I can pass it down to the bottom and then lift it back up. Having some space on the rooftop to work is not a bad idea. And 3 feet to the edge, when the solar modules themselves are 3 1/3 feet wide, 3 feet to the edge is not that much space. Finally, we look at the structural elements, and the corners of your rooftop experience higher wind speeds than the edges of the roof, and also more than the interior of the roof. And so if you go all the way to the edge, you might find that your racking system requires closer attachment points rather than further apart attachment points. And that's a very common mistake in design, is that they'll just use very non-conservative attachment foot spacings. And that might work for an array that goes on the interior of the roof surface, but it might not be within spec if you go all the way to the edge. If you want to know more about the fire code, just research California Solar Fire Code, because they're kind of out front in terms of setting policy, and most jurisdictions, eventually the California policies trickle down into other jurisdictions. And so the California Fire Code will go into the justification of, why you go 6 feet to the edge for commercial. And this is important stuff to know. The California Fire Code says every 150 feet, you need a walkway. Well, the Half Moon building is only 120 feet. So I don't really need a walkway halfway through my array. But if it was 150 feet, I would. And you might have the opinion of, well, that's California and they like to regulate things. Well, actually, that 150-foot spacing comes from field experience, where when arrays covered the whole roof without the walkway, and you have this interconnected steel frame on top of interconnected aluminum frames, what happens is and furthermore, you might have copper home run conductors weaving through the array on a steel or aluminum rack. When you have copper on the roof and conduit that's in a steel conduit that's underneath an aluminum metal solar array, and it's a rooftop that's subject to hot temperatures, once you go more than about 150 feet, the thermal expansion of the racking system can pull the conduit apart, and that started fires. There's the Dietz Watson warehouse fire in New Jersey. It caused like $10 million of damage. There's a Bakersfield fire that's more commonly referenced. In all of these cases, it's not just that there was a blind spot in the inverter system about how they detect ground faults, and with floating arrays that's since been addressed, so it's no longer a concern. The concern is if you put a commercial solar array on a rooftop and you don't break up your racking or use expansion joints or adjust for thermal expansion, your cables could become frayed as they're being pulled apart, and that could start a fire hazard. So you do need, when you're doing commercial arrays, to think about walkway spacing. What California Fire Code says is every 150 feet, you need an 8-foot walkway. And the 8-foot walkway is because firefighters on commercial rooftops, they don't like to cut a 3-foot hole. They like to cut a 4-foot hole. And so you can actually get away with a 4-foot walkway if every 20 feet you can do a little cutout that is sufficient in space to cut a 4-foot by 4-foot square. Now, your other electrical equipment, like your roof-mounted air conditioners, they also have to have 4 feet of accessibility per commercial code. So it's 6 feet off the sides, and then a walkway every 150 feet, and then a 4-foot clearance, and maybe an 8-foot walkway, maybe and with a little bit of wiggle room there. So just Google California Fire Code to get to these walkways. But basically what we've done here is we've sketched out the rooftop on Google Earth, and then we've stayed 3 feet off the sides, 3 feet off the top. Yes, it's a commercial building, but it's the runs are less than 150 feet, and it's a slanted roof. So this is a residential type roof. So we're going to use the residential offset requirements. And then it becomes, well, how many modules can you fill into this larger polygon. Now, the only thing that I would have done differently about this design is that we went and we installed the array, and then a few months later, the skylights began to leak. And that was because we had turned the areas by keeping them excluded from the array. We actually turned the areas around the skylight into walkways, so that when we were working on, this portion of the array, our workers are tromping around the skylight. And so what you need to do is any flashed roof penetration that is near the array, you have to go and reseal that flashing, because you're probably going to be busting the dry caulk that's already sealing that 10-year-old roof penetration. You want to make sure that it gets resealed. Now, what we did in this case is we actually went and removed the skylights and put in more modules to make the array look much nicer from the street. All right. Let's talk about racking. A couple of different components. When I got into the solar industry, these are my project photos. The solar guy who trained me up, and this guy I still have incredible respect for him. When we kind of went our separate ways after the subsidy programs in Texas just began to crash too regularly to sustain business. It was a good deal for the customers, not a really good deal for the installers, and that turned out to be not a good deal for the customers 5 years later, because the installers are all different. Other people trying to get into the game. What this guy did is he went into the off-grid market, and he's a great tiny house off-grid distributor now. But when I asked him about, being a solar guy, engineer, but that doesn't mean I know anything about building envelope construction or framing or sealing. And so I'm asking the solar guru, who's supposed to know everything about solar, or at least is in that position of responsibility, how he seals his penetrations not to cause a leak. Because as a layman to this, I think, well, I'm drilling a hole in the roof, it's gonna leak. I'm not really thinking that every nail, every shingle on this is nailed to the rooftop, so you can poke holes in the roof without causing leaks. But how do you do that in a workmanlike manner? Well, what he says is, well, I drill my pilot hole into the rafter, and I take my commercial grade mastic and I goop up that hole, and I put the bracket on top of it, and then I goop around the top of the bracket, and I drive my lag screw in, and I've never had a problem with it. So I say, well, do you use flashing? He says, no, I just, do you use flashing, or do you use sealant? You use both. You flash and seal each penetration. If I take a roofer up onto the roof, he's going to look at a plumbing vent, and that's flashed and sealed. He's going to look at the oven vent, and that's flashed and sealed. He's going to look at the chimney, and that's flashed and sealed. So to him, he looks at a solar attachment and it's not flashed. We'll say, well, where's the flashing? So that's a roofer with no solar experience being able to lend better advice about water sealing than the solar guy who knows everything. And that roofer doesn't know anything about solar. There's something to be aware of. Now, I'm being too harsh on this guy because, this was back in the day, and nowadays we actually have flashing products where they're integrated into the solar rack. So back then, there really weren't good flashing products for solar, and so installers didn't use them. Nowadays, all professional installers are flashing and sealing their attachments. So you can kind of see this flashing that goes under the shingle. It is not a perfect process, because to get the flashing under the shingle, the flashing actually goes up. To be effective, it needs to go up, past one layer of shingles. In fact, it really goes up to the 2 and a fraction shingles to work. But the shingles are nailed to the rooftop. So you're actually using a pry bar to pry the nails out of the roof where these attachments go. And so you can understand why the fewer attachments, the better, because you're really doing a number on the rooftop as a retrofit. Retrofitting is not a perfect process, but you flash and seal to do as much as you can to mitigate leaking. And in my experience, it's not the brand new flashed and sealed solar attachment point that leaks. It's the pre-existing penetrations that are surrounding the array that you have to be particularly aware of, assuming the array was installed in a compliant and workmanlike manner. Now, no matter what your roof is, there is a racking solution for it. So for a Spanish tile rooftop, it used to be we would put these little hooks that you take the roof apart and put it back together, and you install these hooks that snake out through the tile. Nowadays, you have a flashing component that actually meets the form of the tile, and it completely replaces that tile at that section. So here we have a flat tile rooftop where we can see one of the tiles have been replaced, or a shingle roof where we use flashing. I'm not a fan of standing up the modules. Sometimes you have to. This array down here in the corner, that's a north-facing porch, and we turned it into a south-facing solar array. Now, the production difference between this south-facing array and if we had just stayed flat to the porch, that production difference only about 5%. So we, by tilting the modules up a little bit, we didn't really get that much performance, but we had to. The problem is, okay, so now we have the modules tilted up. When the north wind blows, it's going to catch that wind. And the utility said for that project, y'all better go get a structural engineering stamp. And we did. And it didn't cost us that much. It cost us $500. I think structural stamps should cost more than that. But, that's what we found. We got the stamp. But what if we did not tilt the modules up and just stayed flat to the rooftop? Well, for one, there'd be a lot less wind loading on the roof. So maybe that's not a performance issue, but that is a structural issue. For two, we might have been able to fit 3 rows of modules into this section instead of 2 rows. So the modules might be producing 5% less, but we might have been able to squeeze more production out of that surface. We had to tilt up our modules like that to qualify it for a subsidy program at the local level. The subsidy program only accepted south-facing solar modules. So even though there was only a 5% production difference between the south-facing array versus the north-facing array, even though the economics made it so that it was the same amount of production value either way, because a slightly north-facing array is better in tune for the summertime. And in Texas, summertime electricity is substantially more expensive than wintertime electricity. And so it's not just the production value, it's how much it's worth. And so this slightly north-facing array might be the same value to the customer, but the subsidy program had the mindset that north-facing arrays simply do not work, and south-facing arrays are what you have to do, and that's very limited thinking. But the short of it is, there are racking solutions for every product, and in general, what you have is a little L attachment that gets flashed and sealed, and then you have aluminum rail, and this aluminum rail has a side channel in it that the bracket, called an L foot, gets attached to. And the aluminum rail also has a top channel to it. And what we can see in this picture here is that we have a side channel that gets bolted on, an L-foot bracket that gets lag screwed into the roof, a flashed and sealed attachment. This flashing is actually a little bit better than the other ones we saw because it has a little pathway in it for sealant that'll keep the flashing flat. And it also has the lag screw decoupled from the solar array so that you get a little bit less torque on that lag screw. It's a little bit better covered and sheltered. And then on this top channel here is you get a clipping system that the modules get laid out on the top channel, and the bolt goes down into the channel, and you have a choice of using a hex bolt or a T-bolt. The hex bolts you can find at Lowe's. The T-bolts are specialty. The hex bolts work, but the problem is you have to start at the end and slide them down the channel. The T-bolts you can just put in and give a half turn, and they lock into wherever you need them to go. And so if you don't have any T-bolts or you drop one off the roof, maybe a hex bolt will get you to where you need to be, but it can be complicated because you might not be able to slide it from the end of the rail. There might be other stuff in the way. But we have this clipping system that clamps the modules down onto the rail. Now, there are some variants. Here is a Dynarax fiberglass module racking system. And if you combined a fiberglass racking system with a frameless solar module, that is glass on glass and it gets rid of the aluminum frame, it would be very possible to have a commercial solar array with no metal on the roof. And so if you're in a high lightning area, if you're building right on the coastline where you get a lot of saltwater spray, if you are building on some facility where there's a lot of ammonia gas that could cause corrosion, there are some alternate racking configurations to eliminate the metal. This is a ground mount product that goes on top of a landfill, because on a landfill you can't drive piles into the ground. There's a landfill cap that goes over the landfill. So this is just for setting right on top of the ground, which is not the most elegant way to go about doing a ground mount project, but sometimes you got to. Okay, we've done our array layout. Now we're going to get into racking design. We're kind of getting towards the tail end of class here. So I'm going to go through this racking design real quick, and then we'll close it out and pick it back up tomorrow, finish out the program. But now that we've done our array layout, we've decided where the modules are going to go and where they're not going to go. At that point, you go to your racking manufacturer's website, and they will have racking sizing tools to help you fill out the rest of your balance of system components. And so once we know our array layout, here's our array layout, here's the screenshot from the manufacturer's website where we've rebuilt that array in their configurator. And they'll ask you, what's your wind speed, what's your snow load, what's your exposure category, and it'll tell you we have different gauges of rail. And so this rail could accommodate a 4 to 5 foot span, depending on if you're at the corner, the edge, or the middle of the roof. Here's a thicker gauge rail where you could have an 8 foot to 10 foot span. But what the racking companies are only looking at is the strength of the racking, not the strength of the rooftop. And so on Half Moon's array, metal roof, purlins, kind of a barn-like structure, which means that the roof truss is probably not overbuilt. You know, I called up the racking company and they said, man, you're going to love our new XR1000. The rail gauge is so thick, you can go 10 feet between penetrations. Fewer penetrations, less roof leaks. And if I go to the developer or the building owner and I say fewer penetrations, less building leaks, they say thumbs up. You know, great. Well, I go to the structural engineer and I say, well, if my penetrations are every 10 feet instead of every 4 feet, the structural engineer goes, there's 2.5 times as much loading on each attachment. And it came back from our structural engineering report on the building that for this particular building on this particular roof, the attachments had to be 2 foot on center. So I told that to the sales rep, and he says, well, we can give you a structural engineering stamp that says 10 foot on center. And I say, no, I'm not talking about how the racking attaches to the roof. I'm talking about how the racking impacts the roof truss. And so I don't need your 10-foot over thick rail. I want to go use your cheapest racking system that's incredibly thin gauge, that's only rated for a 4 to 5 foot span, because I don't need the extra strength in the rack, because my attachments are going to be 2 foot on center. And here you also see the danger, whereas if I'm a solar installer and I'm used to doing a 6 foot on center attachment spacing, it might be that in the middle of the rooftop, I'm fine. My rail might be rated for, or let's say I'm being conservative and doing 4 foot on center. I might be fine and with a rail that's rated for a 5 foot span doing a 4 foot span. But then I get all the way to the edge of the rooftop and I'm right up against the upper spec of my rail. And so what I'm going to want to do is at the corners of my rooftop, and then we'll end and go to the quiz. And we'll pick back up on this tomorrow. We'll cover these slides. But essentially the short of it is, and we'll go back through all this, getting more into loading discussions tomorrow. But the point is, for optimal rack design, you're going with, as a standard, a 4 foot on center span. And then between your rails, you want to stagger that 4 foot span, because if your rafters are 2 foot on center, what you want to do is hit every rafter as you go across the rooftop. So here, we're going 2 foot on center, and the next rail up, we're staggering those attachments 1 rafter over. And then finally, if you're in an area of heavy snow load, you want to put attachments, along the bottom. And then finally, if you're going all the way to the edges of the rooftop, you want to put additional attachments, not just 4 foot on center, but at the corners, you may want to consider 2 foot on center. And so just as your attachments on typicals on residential rooftops, 4 foot on center, but 2 foot on center in the corners, and then maybe 2 foot on center all across the very bottom rail in areas of heavy snow. That'll get you to a strong residential racking for pretty much all your rooftops except barn metal roofs, at which point you may have to do 4 foot on center. And of course, all of this does ultimately depend on what's underneath that roof deck.